seminar, which is hosted by the STEP Centre and is part of a link with the new PASTRES project, linking to pastoralism and development. And we're delighted to have Mathilde Gingembre, who's here. Very familiar with IDS. She did her PhD here a while back, now based in Amman in Jordan, but has done extensive research over the years on land, pastoralism, and issues of development in Madagascar. And she's going to be talking about bringing moral economy into the study of land deals, which I think is interesting to many of us, but particularly focusing on Madagascar. So, Mathilde, thank you for coming, and over to you.
Thank you, Ian. Yes, so in this seminar I will present some of the findings of that PhD research I carried out here at IDS Sussex with, under the supervision of Ian Schoon and James Sundberg. It draws on ethnographic work in southern Madagascar, and it explored how the voices of local people get heard or silenced in the context of farmland privatization in agrarian economies. It highlighted the variety of responses that agropastoralists gave to the implementation of an agribusiness project on their land, and it showed that local voices and opportunities for influence in the context of land transactions in Madagascar are constructed at the intersection of village and national politics. So power, gender, age and class divides were established as key variables to consider when exploring variation in local people's responses to land deal. However, I also identified a lens of analysis that is less discussed and which I argue is critical to the understanding of local responses to land deal, and that is moral economic consideration, and this is what I'd like to explore with you today. Anthropologies of moral economy, which draw from the scholarship of Edward Thompson and the anthropologist James Scott, explore a popular perspective of justice with regards to economic transaction and the expectation that tie people to their rulers, especially in times of economic turmoil. It looks at people's moral standards with regards to economic matters and highlights the moral terms through which economic realities are routinely apprehended. So what stirred my interest in the concept of moral economy was the realization that even though Malagasy subsistence farmers and pastoralists didn't know their legal rights, their narratives of land deal negotiations showed a strong sense of entitlement. They had no idea that entitled land actually did not belong to the state but to themselves. Yet they talked a lot about their rights, and for many about how these had been violated in the context of corporate land access. The company was expected to respect a number of conditions for the land deal to be considered fair, but so were the other people benefiting from the land deal, as well as their own elites, whose action had an impact on their livelihood and food security. For those reasons, the moral economist thinkers' insistence on poor people's action and thinking in the economic realm, being premised on norms and value, quickly resonated with what I was observing on the ground. So what was this sense of entitlement premised on, and what did it revolve around? What synergies and clashes could be observed in the declination of these rights in the context of land deal negotiations? So this research drew on ethnographic study of the local level negotiation that were carried out by an Italian-owned company called Tozzi Green to gain land access for their large-scale biofuel and biomass plantation project. The Irumbe Plateau, which they chose for their project, is a rural area of southern Madagascar where people live off unmechanized subsistence or semi-subsistence agriculture and extensive pastoralism, and where wealth, influence, and prestige stems from cattle ownership. Tozzi Green started operating there in 2010 with the aim of developing on a total area of 100,000 hectares by 2019. They failed with their jatropha plantation, so then they switched to flex crops, corn and sunflower mainly. And I chose this very case study after having visited another 5 in the island for 2 main reasons. First, because there'd been a coordinated bottom-up resistance against the project. It was very short-term, but it happened at a critical political conjuncture and with the support of civil society organization, and gained political traction and scored points. The second reason was that the company held some consultation at the village level, when most of the other companies, I visited Madagascar, had limited their local consultation effort to 1 meeting at the level of the municipality. So the map you see here is a reflection of this negotiation process. It represents the area that were leased, that were included in the first lease given to the agribusiness company in 2012. So the 6,500 hectares it gained was spread over 15 non-contiguous tracts. They're in black and white hatches here. And that was partly the result of this village-by-village negotiation process, and partly also a result of the company's commitment to spare farmland and focus only on rangeland. And my focus was on the responses that villagers brought to the consultation process, and also the other initiatives that were taken outside of these invited spaces of negotiation. So I carried 3 field visits in 3 different years for a total of 10 months of field work. Repeated semi-structured interviews, focus group discussions, informal discussion with a wide range of actors involved in the negotiation process for a total of 142 research participants. And I combined this with a search and review of documents related to the deal-making process. I followed an inductive approach, and my data collection moved from an inter-village comparison. During my second fieldwork, I visited a total of 26 villages, so all the dots are villages. I didn't put the names for anonymization purposes. And then during my third fieldwork, I carried out 3 in-depth village case study. So today I want to try and pull together the finding of this research project on the moral economic expectation that underpinned both compliance with and resistance to corporate land access. I will first highlight the local population's internal contention in the context of land deal negotiations, pointing to power imbalances and social divides as important dynamics for understanding variation in engagement with the consultation process. I will then point to counter-examples that demonstrate that these broad patterns of explanation fall short of exhausting the complexity of local perspectives, and which point to the importance of considerations of relational justice in the constructions of responses to land deal. I then explore the rights and obligations that emerge from these moralized land deal narratives, showing that beyond the disagreements that divide local community, a consensus on the moral economic obligations of those benefiting directly or indirectly from corporate land access is observed. And I conclude this paper by highlighting the key role that considerations of relational justice within village economies themselves can play in bolstering or undermining local people's influence in land deal. So in the first wave of literature that emerged after the contemporary surge in large-scale land deal, there was a noted tendency to assume, rather than to demonstrate what the reactions of local people in land deals would be. And they were too frequently described as either subservient victims of imposed land deals or unified resistors against them. But as emphasized by the more rigorous work that followed, responses from below varied across time and space, and as I soon observed too, they could vary within a local community in the context of a same transaction as well. So the 26 villages I visited revealed a whole spectrum of perspective among village leaders. Those range from hopeful enthusiasm towards the agribusiness project and its promises of job and social economic services, to outright anger and concern at land losses, through more nuanced positions. This plurality of view was confirmed with by the next field work, where closer scrutiny of these dynamics revealed that cleavages did not only cut between villages, but that disagreement could divide at the very level of the kin group itself. Social divides and patterns of inequalities along class, gender, and kinship were established as key variables for understanding this variation. What both the comparative analysis and the village case study established was that the strongest opposition to the agribusiness project came from cattle owners and village elites in general, whilst those interested in trading land for jobs and access to socio-economic services and compensation came predominantly from those groups who had little control over land or cattle and who were under the social and economic domination of others. So beyond opportunities for increased well-being and livelihood diversification, what the more dominated villages saw in the agribusiness company was prospect of increased autonomy. It was not only that they had less to lose from a land they did not control, they also saw some potential for some emancipation from the local structures of domination. Wealthy cattle owners, for their part, needed the land as a basis of their wealth and authority in a context of extensive pastoralism. The land transferred to or feared to be transferred to the agribusiness company was either land they used for grazing or important land reserves that would soon be needed in the context of growing population and related increased pressure on landed resources. Besides this agreement over which struggles to carry out in the context of the deal, whether against dispossession or for an incorporation into the corporate venture, also came contentions over the right to talk during consultation processes. In the Irumbe region, as in most community-based natural resource management system, access rights, withdrawal rights, management rights, exclusion rights, and alienation rights are distributed in complex combinations, and they're regularly renegotiated, mainly verbally, which means that decisions as to who to address in consultation is particularly sensitive and political. And many consultation processes will be based on formal administrative territories, divisions used by the state, and not on lived spaces on which local rules of land tenure apply. So even when efforts are made, like in the case of Tutsi Green, to try and talk to local landowners, that is, to those who own alienation rights locally, they still run the risk of excluding others who may not have decision-making power on the land, but whose livelihood highly depend on their access and use of this land. Also, in the context of the flexibility and the negotiability that characterize community-based natural resource management system, there's no guarantee that people will agree on who owns these alienation rights on the land. I have statistics on the number of land disputes and disagreements over who should have been consulted by Tutsi Green. Out of the 26 villages, there were a total of 8 who were contesting land transfers, and out of the 3 village case studies that I explored in more depth, the 2 also lamented illegitimate land transfers, and the other one, they suspected maybe the land they thought had been grabbed without anyone being consulted had actually secretly been given by neighboring villages or members of their own kin group. And this led to numerous conflicts and disputes between and inside villages, highlighting the potential of land deal negotiations interfering tensions within local population. And the fact that in discussions over the justice of land deals, most conversation revolved around the legitimacy or illegitimacy of the entity consulted. In terms of the public responses to the consultation, less variation was found. A great majority of consulted village leaders complied with the corporate land requests. 17 out of the 20 were consulted. But there were two interesting findings that emerged, however. Behind this compliance, there were very different perspectives on the project, with some describing their compliance as the result of intimidation and others more as genuine consent driven by hope for some benefits, although they also often reported some pressures from local officials and the company managers to comply. And in this general context of pressure to comply, 3 villages did feel emboldened and entitled to refuse the corporate land request, one of which had support from its mayor and wealthy cattle owners of the municipality. The other 2 who were well-connected, richer villages. So these findings suggested differentiated vulnerability to power pressures, with some village leaders who felt free to go against official directives and openly reject the implementation of the agribusiness project on their land during the consultation or in other spaces, and those who felt forced to comply. So to summarize in very broad strokes, the broad patterns of responses to the consultation, there were on the one hand the dominant villages whose wealth relies on cattle and extensive land use, who expressed concern and bitterness towards the company. And on the other hand, the underprivileged dominated villages who showed a stronger inclination towards corporate land access. And as far as responses were concerned, the more powerful villages had generally encountered more success at resisting intimidation or negotiating favorable terms of deal compared to those villages who were less connected, less educated, who had found it more difficult to express their voices in consultation. And this is obviously an important reminder of how inequalities and power gaps can inform very different interests within agropastoral societies. But I thought the real interesting findings were not there. What was really interesting actually were the compelling counter-examples which I encountered and which indicated that presumed rational interests along class, gender and age could not easily summarize the perspective on land deals, and which pointed to the importance of moral economic considerations in local responses to the penetration of capital in agrarian economies. Among the villages I talked to, indeed, I found on the one hand wealthy cattle owners displaying a strong support to the agribusiness project, and on the other hand, some poor or disenfranchised villages who were condemning it. So some of these counterexamples were simply evidencing the complexity of social identities at the intersection of multiple social divides. For example, I did encounter women who were opposed to the land deal, but among those, however, 2 were married into the family of village leaders, which meant that land loss was likely to be more of a concern than it would have been to more underprivileged women. And of course, one can't exclude that these criticisms were discourses stemming from the fear of sanction, where they found to contradict their husbands or fathers in public. There were, however, cases where the intersectionality of domination attributes made for more compelling refutation of the broad patterns outlined before. Like this young woman, for example, from a poor kin group, who had expressed a resounding satisfaction at the fact that their own village leaders had refused to give land since the company hadn't delivered on the promises made to the villagers who had, or those young cow herders from some poor villages who did not own cattle themselves and were not necessarily looking after a lot of them, but so therefore needed less rangeland than more endowed neighbors, but who strongly resented the company's land appropriation as they hadn't received any kind of compensation, whereas a significant amount of their village land had been transferred to Tutsi Green, and which made it difficult for them to find grazing land for the cattle they were entrusted with. And yeah, inversely, there were cases of wealthy village elites who had enthusiastically welcomed the company. The most compelling example was that of the Lunaki, the lineage chief of the village of Betungolo, who owned more than 5,000 heads of cattle, and who explained, for example, that he had voluntarily agreed to give land, and he was happy that he had. And some of the reasons he brought are important. He was happy because, one, he had been consulted. Second, he had been able to choose the tract of land to be transferred, and that was only a small tract compared to his total possession. That choice of land had been respected by the company, and finally that small gift had been retributed in some useful manner for their farming activities. So it had also allowed him to build social capital by building relations with a powerful foreigner. So these examples that go against the main patterns were a good reminder of the fact that people's view of land deals are fundamentally subjective and socially situated perceptions, and that these are influenced by the geographic dimensions of corporate land access with regards to the social, spatial organization of their respective agro-pastoral livelihoods. So which land and how much and where, and whether or not it hampered their own livestock and agricultural farming activities, and also influenced by local people's own experiences with the consultation process, whether and how they were involved, the nature of the information that was given, which compensation were promised, etc. But what's even more interesting here is that beyond these different contrasted narratives, the filters of judgments were similar, and common moral values and norms were expressed across social divides. So at both ends of the spectrum, the stress was put on compensation, respect, measure, pointing to the main standards over which the fairness of land deals are constructed. So, yes, these moral standards I found were revolved around three main rights and obligations that I'm going to explore in more detail now. Subsistence rights, respect for their voices and decision-making power on their ancestral land, and obligation of reciprocity. Subsistence right was identified by James Scott as a key element of the moral economies of peasantries across time and space. In the life of those who regularly face the risk of famine, he argues subsistence security is the primordial goal, in the light of which peasants examine their relationship with their neighbors, with elites, with the state, etc. Through time, and specific patterns of norms, value, and obligations develop in support of that safety first principle. So originally an economic issue, the quest for subsistence insurance therefore comes to be experienced as a pattern of moral rights. The subsistent needs becomes a subsistence right. And this came across very strongly in people's justification of their perspectives on the Tutsi Green land deal. So for those resentful of the land privatization, one of the most cited reasons for outrage was the lack of consideration for their hardships and for their subsistence needs. The main source of concern was, of course, the loss of grazing land, and the company managers that I talked to were insisting on the vastness of the land available and on the fact that their modalities of land appropriation, these 15 parcels that we saw, as opposed to a big chunk of land, had prevented most villagers from full dispossession. However, each single tract appropriated represented the loss of often critical rangeland to some village or hamlet. But shortage of pasture was not the sole source of concern. Farming was often frequently affected, even though no irrigated lowlands for rice paddy was appropriated by the company. And the reason is that the agriculture in the Urumbe is largely unmechanized. And so it relies on the availability of cattle, whether owned or borrowed, before and after the harvest. In the absence of plows, fields are prepared thanks to the hitsaki. There is. This century-old practice found across the whole Austronesian region, to which Madagascar historically belongs, where zebus are made to run in the rice paddies to prepare the land for rice transplantation. And in 2 of the 3 villages in which I stayed during my last field trip, as in quite a few villages as well that I visited the year before, no cattle corridors had been left to allow the cattle to be taken to the rice paddies. Cattle obviously also represented a key drought force to transport crop yields to markets. Yes, the other reason why Todzi ended up affecting farming as well was the fact that it was not only the lowlands that people needed for farming. With the demographic pressure and climatic challenges, the highlands which were targeted by the company were increasingly being used for rain-fed agriculture as well. So the appropriation by the company was therefore depriving local people of a critical land asset to support the farming diversification strategy they had developed in response to those pressing challenges to their food security. And subsistence rights required some measure in land appropriation, an area on which Todzi had failed critically in certain places. Like in the poor hamlet of Manalube, for example, where the loss of pastures had resulted in a few zebus dying during the dry season and their owners taking most of the rest of the flock back. And they explained, before we used to graze to the west of our hamlet, but now there's jatropha on both sides of the road, so we can't go through. Now we only have the east of the village left to graze, but the problem is that there are more and more rice paddies there as well, so we don't really have any grassland left to take the cattle to. And for those who accepted giving land to get jobs, subsistence right implied having decent salaries when working for the company. But jobs were generally, the jobs given were generally short-lived and low paid according to local standards. Subsistence rights also justify their claims to be involved in the negotiation process. And those villagers who hadn't been consulted saw a double sanction. Not only they had not received any compensation, but they hadn't been able to influence the choice of the tract. And often this would mean that the tract taken by the company would be located on their best grazing land or close to their stockyards. So as a result, the corporate plantation could be a serious hindrance to their livelihood activities, and not only for rich cattle owners, but also for cow herders. And they said that major difficulties could have been avoided had these tracts been taken in less treacherous location. So respect for their subsistence right therefore underpin a moral duty to consult widely, and not just those villagers who held alienation rights. And indignation was also expressed at the fact that some, the mainly local state agents, had made a lot of profit at their expense. So they were suffering from pressures on already stretched resources and strained livelihoods, and on the other hand, some were making money. So criticisms towards local state agents were actually at least as frequent, if not more frequent, than those expressed towards the company. And there, where I found that while enrichment was acceptable, the enrichment by treason and through suffering was not. And some people warned that these people would be electorally sanctioned for it. And actually 2 of the 3 mayors of the 3 municipalities affected by the land deal were not re-elected. So they confirmed that, as such, the moralizing of an economy in which, as James Scott noted, inequalities in wealth are accepted provided they contribute to some degree to the overall good of the community. So intangible matters related to respect for their voices and belief system also occupied a central position in people's account of the outcomes of the land deal. Those who expressed satisfaction at the agribusiness project pointed to the fact that the choice they had expressed during consultation had been respected, whether they decided to give land or not. And this meant that the company appropriating the precise land that villagers had chosen not only limited adverse impact, but also generated feelings of trust and respect. Research participants whose voice had been ignored or choice not respected brought up the inverse feeling of mistrust. One day, I bumped into one of the foreigners, so I told them, how can we have a good relationship with you when we've asked to keep some of our land and you don't do it? It doesn't work like that. So it was clearly the offense to the authorities, village leader or legitimate landowners, as much as the loss of the land itself that was being condemned. And exclusions and insufficient dialogue meant that essential social and ritual prescriptions had been utterly violated as well. People frequently lamented the fact that land had changed hands without the benediction of their ancestors. And in view of ancestors' power on the destiny of the living generations, these omissions were also a great source of concern. Their safety and food security depended on the ancestors feeling respected and being spared from their anger. So to be perceived as fair and right, a transaction on land could not be conducted without having been endorsed by ancestors first. And yes, that's a picture of a bit dark, of a ceremony of Cipirano where they ask for benediction of their ancestors and forgiveness. And yes, finally, obligations of reciprocity. At the heart of moral economies of peasant, Scott noted that also principles of reciprocity and paternalism. Local people's narrative on the land deal indeed reflected a strong internalization of these principles. The company's position of power did not spare them from a duty of gratitude and from the obligations that come with land control. And parallels were regularly made between the sacrifices made by villagers and the lack of gratitude shown by the company. The second main grudge after land loss was the extra workload caused by Tutsi Green's plantation. In a village, for example, they had to take their cattle some 8 kilometers away from their village for grazing. And the proximity of the Tutsi Green plantation, like in a lot of villages, also meant that their cattle's movement had to be monitored closely to avoid damage to the corporate plantations. So whereas in the past they could let the cattle roam freely, at least for a day or half a day somewhere, from now on they had to stay with them to make sure they wouldn't go and graze on the company's plantation for fear of incurring sanctions. That was especially the case with the plantations of corn that the Zebus were going for. So one of the villagers observed that they were effectively protecting the corporate fields for free. Because the Bara people of the Iombe Plateau indeed have a very interesting system of land tenure, where land control is associated with a number of obligations related to imperatives of security. There's been problems of cattle theft for decades there, which have increased in the past years. And so whoever owns the land has an obligation to closely monitor any suspected movement of stolen cattle on that land. And failure to do so implies having to compensate the injured party for their loss. So feelings of injustice stem from the fact that whereas rights to graze on the land had been lost, the obligations of protection for that land remained. And so someone said, it's really a big problem for us to have their plantations there, but do foreigners think it's easy to raise cattle? There's always a risk that they might escape if we don't wake up during the night to check on them. And that's not only when it's raining that they try and escape. Now with the jatropha there, we really have to keep a close eye on them all the time. And resentment for a lack of decent compensation was especially severe in the places where the collaboration with the company had been made at the risk of alienating village leaders and elites. This came very strongly in certain villages where people had engaged in backdoor bargaining with the company, disrespecting their leader's decision. So feelings of betrayal towards the company were growing as their land gifts were not being reciprocated by, they were being reciprocated by underpaid jobs and inappropriate compensation. So not only were their hopes disappointed, but the treason they had shown to their village leaders to allow for the land transfers was made even more difficult to defend. And in that respect, decisions to express subversive voices in the context of the consultation seemed to be partly related to perception of how much was at risk with regards to how wealthy villagers performed in terms of their own obligations to help and share. What I observed was that instances of backdoor negotiation with the company by the poor were always accompanied by some sense of insecurity in the safety mechanisms of their own villages, and in places where the village wealth was not shared. And this relates to another finding of this research, was that those villages who did manage to influence the land deal were those who proved able to avoid or suppress dissent within their own communities by galvanizing unity around moral economies within the village population. When a village elite provide essential support and capital, antagonizing them is a risk that the subalterns seemed to weigh carefully. So whether struggling for incorporation or against dispossession, the key to success highlighted by this research seemed to lie in the capacity to activate intra and inter-class solidarity ties, thereby avoiding the risk of colliding struggles. Oh, I forgot this. So, yeah, coming to a conclusion, rather than being the direct result of socio-economic positions, the decision to comply or to resist corporate land access are always underpinned by what Thompson described as legitimizing notions. For those who complied, their support or their tolerance of the land deal was conditioned to manifestations of respect for the choices they had voiced, to the application of measure in land appropriation, and to granting fair opportunities and compensation. For those who expressed opposition, it was failings to show that measure and that respect by those brokering or benefiting from the land deal that justified their grudges and concern. So, whether expressed or tacit, local people's opposition to corporate land access brings compelling evidence to the a growing population's resistance to the demoralizing of land deals. However powerful, those brokering, benefiting from, or refusing corporate land access are to show respect for who they were, for who they are, their authority, their voices, their livelihoods, their social identities and spiritual obligations, but also for what their needs were. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mathilde. What a fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
Come and join us at the front here. And we've got 15 minutes or so before a break at 2. Those who have to go to classes and whatnot, please feel free to go at 2. And otherwise, we'll carry on discussing till 2:30. So we'll open it up. But I think just a short comment to thank you for this, because I think although you focus very particularly on your site, this is a much bigger story. You've related this to the much bigger story of what happens when investment at a frontier of capital encroaches in areas that are used in other ways. And exactly as you say, a lot of the debate about land deals that exploded after 2008 was very simplistic. And I think what you've brought to this is the nuance and the detail that requires us to think a little bit more carefully. What does resistance mean? What does investment mean? And how those negotiations happen. And certainly, for those of us who are working in pastoral areas, which are increasingly the frontier of this type of investment, this is really key. This is really key because we see it again and again in different sites that these confrontations, either with land, with agricultural expansion, or with renewable energy, or extractivism of various sorts, are throwing up exactly these questions. So I think it's really important that this study links to that wider debate. So anyway, let's open it up to everybody else. People want general or specific questions. Let's take a cluster. Don't be shy. Vivian. Okay.
Thank you, that was really, really great. I have, I guess, 2 questions. One was, I think you show the kind of diversity of world economies and contestations within this place really, really well, but I was wondering about how much of these moral economies are shaped by a consciousness or an awareness of the sort of bigger picture. So, what is Chitropa? What is its role outside of this place?
Very interesting.
Those kinds of things. And I think a related issue with that question about that is the kind of civil society groups who are perhaps not in this space, and what are some of those actions that are shaping the
Great
way
question.
people are expressing their resistance or compliance. And I think the other question was around the first thing you mentioned in the beginning, which is really interesting, that this was the only company that held consultations at the village level. So I was wondering about, whether that actually allowed for the expression of a lot of this resistance and negotiation, and what happened to sort of the other villages where that consultation was not even happening.
You crammed quite a few questions.
Thank you.
Very well done. Let's have Julia and
Yeah, thank you, Mathilde. It was really interesting, and I read quite a lot on land, but I think I've never come across a paper that actually discusses, like the moral economy and the contradictions at the local level vis-a-vis land deals. So I think it's really interesting to get into that and try to understand better, no? Which also made me think, because like among the land defenders there were also like landowners, no? defending their land. So that's also a often untold story kind of thing. But I was wondering, I mean, you must have thought a lot about moral economy throughout your PhD. So I was thinking, and we are coming to think about it, like this moral versus non-moral economy. To me, it sounds a little bit like, I don't know, what does that mean? So I was wondering, what's your thought about, you know, like moral economy and the relationship between just different economies, or, you know.
Okay, that's good. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, let's have one more in this round, and then we'll continue.
Yeah, so I know Madagascar is a patchwork of land registration and certification of titling, but I was just curious in people's claim making if that produced any variation as to whether people had titled their land or certified their land, or was still under customary tenure, and how that sort of varied maybe between villages or between even people within villages.
Thank you.
Do you want to have a go at that?
Yeah,
There's
thank
quite a
you.
lot there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
That can-
hold on to the next round. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for all the great questions. So, if I understand correctly, the first question was how much moral economies are shaped by the actual nature of the crop that is being grown, right? Or if it's not, I'll jump on this because it's an interesting question.
Just jump on whatever you like.
Yeah,
You don't have to answer every detail.
You mentioned the fact that it was de Tropha, and I think that definitely had an impact on people's perceptions of the land deal, and what their interests were and what had to be lost, and the moral economy of land revolving around that subsistence rights and food security, and then suddenly you have a company who's asking for a wide amount of land to plan something that they know for a fact that they won't be able to use, right? The difference between, maybe food crops or flex crops, at least, they, can think that, it will be somehow to their benefits, or, that they can help grow them as well. So this definitely signs an exclusion, and this is shaking what they see land is for, and what is, also showing that their future is not part of this. It's sending a strong signal. A very interesting question as well about the civil society groups not necessarily understanding the complexity of those moral economies on the ground, and also having their own agendas, right? And I saw this very strongly in this case, because there was, as I mentioned, a bottom-up or resistance movement backed by a diaspora group, a civil society organization of Malagasy based in France, who did a great job at advertising the case at a very interesting political conjuncture in the middle of elections. So it gained, it made big buzz, and it ended up having an impact on this very land deal with a vice prime minister who was contending for the elections, asking for these operations to be stopped, or for the extension of the land extensions to be stopped. So they played a key role. Yeah, I think in a way that really is quite symptomatic of civil society engagement in the issue of land grabbing. They had their agenda, and I don't think they would be very keen to hear that complexity. Very often there is a sort of disproportionate support for those who are going to be resisting against the land deal, and that's the story that they published, right? That they talked about, but they didn't talk about those poorer villagers who didn't, who needed, or could be interested in the livelihood diversification opportunities that seemed to come with the project, but would have needed would critically need help to negotiate better terms of the deal. And these people are completely forgotten. And did the consultation actually make a difference? So in some places it did, and in others it didn't. And some of it was down to what the, what villagers actually did. There were so a lot of protest letters were written, petition to local officials. Some took part in this resistance movement I just talked about. But what I found out was actually the village politics were more critical. So if they were consulted and they refused, but some poor, 2 weeks later, the mayor told the company, "Oh, don't worry about these village leaders. They're never going to say yes. Just talk to these guys. They're still from the village and they can sign as members of the village, and they will approve of the land deal because they're upset against their own authorities or they have nothing to lose." So that was really critical. Of course, people needed to be consulted to be able to influence, which track would be taken in a way that wouldn't impact their own agro-pastoral livelihoods, but they also needed to make sure they agreed. And I went really fast on this, but apologies, but that's one of the things that really fascinated me about this project, and influence was all about also managing their own village inter-community relations. When there was trust in their own village leaders, and they knew they depended on them and they could rely on them in case of shocks, then, the poorer villagers who could still be interested in having access to a school or hospital or, a couple of months of job, were still thinking, "Oh, that, it's a big risk to take to upset my own elite." So yeah, 2 big conditions for the consultation to actually work in the favor of the villagers. Okay, Julia's question. Moral versus immoral, right? What does that mean to people? I think I follow you, and what's interesting, and I don't think I stressed it enough, is that moral economies are contested and dynamic, right? So it's not like I like James Scott's work. He's great at finding these universal principles, which I think are critical, as subsistence rights and obligations of reciprocity. But the way some of them will see, the justice of a land deal would be seen. The core principles are, shared, but the people's interpretation of how these, principles can be implemented will vary according to their own experiences and their own positions. And it's all very dynamic, the way some village leaders manage to convince, their own villagers that it would be a big loss to give some land, that there was no future with this, and that even though they were not very rich, at least they could rely on their own food, they could rely on their own crops to provide them with food security, and, convincing them that this was, the justice and food security was there, as opposed to, looking at the moral economic transgressions that had seemed to happen in other villages. And moral economy in relation with other economies. Could you rephrase that question, please?
We don't have to go, we can discuss it a bit more later, but
okay.
Maybe just offer some...
And on the land registration, yeah, thanks as well for this question. In this case, as in most rural Madagascar, the land was entitled. But what's the other thing that made this case, but more generally Madagascar, a really interesting site for the study of land deals, is the fact that legally land users' rights on land are protected because a reform was passed in 2005 which made untitled land the land of its users, which decided that the untitled land was no longer state-owned land, and that meant that whenever someone wants to privatize land, the state can no longer come and say, all right, show this tract to an investor and say you can have this if you want. It's untitled. There are obligations. This comes with obligations of consultation, and this requires a much longer process, which allows for all these micro, local, contested dynamics to happen. Because this took 2 years to negotiate these 6,000 hectares, which makes a big difference to. It's a very different in other contexts, legal contexts, where untitled land belongs to the state, and the state can just give away 10,000 hectares like this. Thank you.
Great. I know a few people may have to go, but please don't if you can stay, because we've got at least 3 or 4 new questions coming up now. And Natasha, I think, had a hand up first, and then Dolph, in the next round. But yeah, let's. A few people I know have to go to other meetings and whatnot.
Thank you.
So, Natasha, fire away.
I had a bunch of questions actually.
Try one. Poor Mathilde.
I know, it's great.
About like village leaders or like villages making decisions for or against this land appropriation, what is the process of decision making, or what is the social organization of authority within the community through which these decisions are made?
Mm-hmm.
That's one question. Then the second question was about, as you said, the state doesn't own the land or is not, it cannot mediate between the industry and the community. But for example, as you said, that this happened at a critical political moment. Or was there a point at which, for example, the community turned to the state, say the court, or something or the other, and what was the state's involvement along these lines? And then the third question, I think, which might be related to Vidya's question, is in terms of this bigger picture, you see, this is green grabbing in the sense that they see that, okay, this is for something that might be environmentally beneficial in terms of biofuels. It's still working with the land in a certain sense. And so obviously that sort of industry might have different, the green grabbing discourse is differently deployed than an industrial discourse. And so how does that play? Big questions.
Well, you sneaked them all in then, didn't you? Dolph.
Thank you, Mathilde. As you were explaining and answering some of the earlier questions, I think you're starting to say more about the role of the state, which I would have wanted to hear a bit more about. Given that you positions of the moral economy as dynamic, and also given, I suppose, my reading of Spots, for instance, is that the moral economies are particularly developing in areas where the state is actually quite distant, where the state is absent or has been historically absent. Now, with these land deals, there's clearly a greater presence of the state. So to what extent do you see this increasing presence of the state affecting the nature of these local moral economies, and where legal rights, land rights, as enshrined by law, become perhaps much more important than these local notions of justice? Where's this driving?
That's a nice question.
Yeah, great questions. Thank you, everyone.
I think Richard has his hand up.
Oh, Richard, do you have your hand up first?
Well, this sort of relates, and I may not have heard it all, but my picture is that many of the companies have deals with the state above or below the table and otherwise. So the state has very particular interest to pressure the local communities to accept or not. Am I right on that? Did you deal with it and I just didn't hear? Or?
Why don't you take that cluster?
Yeah, the state.
Is yours in the same vein?
So we can wait.
Yeah, because that's a nice cluster around authority, the role of the state, and
And corruption.
shifts the nature of moral economies. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much for these questions. I didn't have time to go into this.
You've got a big thesis somewhere.
Right, exactly. But that was that was the other main focus of this PhD, was on the national politics of land deals. Still a focus on the local, like, the state, the local state, how it, the way it is, well, top-down dynamics, but as lived experience by local state agents. So there was definitely the traditional pressures of and interests of state, like states where, the economy depend on extroversion and on welcoming private investments, being extremely biased. So institutional bias was there, and it was prevalent at the national level, at the regional level, at the local level, with everyone wanting his share of the cake, which also, what was interesting is that in a way ended up, basically what I found the interesting findings I think I got around this was the fact that all these politics ended up making the process lengthier, because sometimes there was an interest in supporting, the investor, but there was also interest sometimes in sort of making their support conditional on certain things and waiting for the company to deliver, so that ended up giving more time to the villagers to get the information and to know what was going on and to try and find allies to protest. In terms of the local state agent involvement in the consultation process, that was also critical. And I describe their powers as powers of exclusion and powers of compliance. Either they had the power, a small mayor, in a way, so to say, could decide they would be the one, and they often the one companies go to, even when they try and do things right and consult villagers, they're going to ask, they need brokers, they need someone who tells them where to go. So, local state agents can, exclude people de facto by saying, go and talk to this village, this villager, and not this one, How can, it's so complex, how can, a foreign company know who owns the land? And so that was powers of exclusion. And then they had these strong powers of compliance, where they were distorting legal realities, or actually themselves not knowing, for example, that entitled land did not belong to the state, or, just intimidating people. So this is a great question, Dolph. Thank you. I was looking, all these questions are going to help me as well develop this further. This focus on, the dynamism of moral economy. In this case, and how, this, there was definitely a lot was said about, in these negotiations about people's expectation towards their own state leaders. And this, as I said, there was some expectation there was an understanding that they were in a moral economy of extroversion, where their own state leaders needed foreigners to sort of survive themselves, to have resources, just illegal, but also resources of patronage that they needed. And that was fine. There was this is what I really found fascinating, was there was this sort of red line that it's fine for you to make money out of this, but just make sure it doesn't come at the expense of our own livelihoods, right? So you're right, like through these corporate ventures, the state is suddenly coming in, because otherwise it's pretty absent. In this place is something that can be feared, definitely, because they can always send you to prison, and they have the power of, they know how to write, and they have the power of deciding that you've done something that's not quite right. But, so these are negotiated relationships, but this definitely completely shifted things, and it's a really interesting aspect to look into. Green grabbing discourses. Yes. Yes, this did, this I think makes it more difficult for civil society opposing land grabbing to sort of, there's these counter discourses about, we're using the land in a, green, in an environmentally friendly way in places where rangeland is highly degraded. And the legitimacy of these discourses in international settings makes it harder to counter than when it's only. But now there's been a lot of talks around the problem of growing biofuel instead of food crops, and biofuel at the expense of food security. So it did make, it was still heard. It was their condemnation of land grabbing still managed to get over this. Sorry if I forgot some question.
This is fantastic. We've got a line of
the
other
process
ones.
of decision making.
You've
Thank
been
you.
waiting for a while, so yeah.
Thanks.
I have to
That was one. So, got a question which kind of builds on the last discussion. So basically, even if the principles of the moral economy were violated in one of these land deals, were these principles being reasserted in any way which seriously forced companies or the state to pay attention to their differences? Were there, for instance, any acts of violent disruption or destruction of appropriated farmland or properties? And if not, if there were no such acts of serious resistance, what I would call serious resistance, would that suggest that a moral economy becomes less relevant as external capital engages with it by the state?
Great question. Thanks, Dan.
Sam, did you want to add on to that? Yes.
Dan talked about sort of overt resistance, but it'd be quite interesting to see also sort of like illegal acts of. It's really interesting you talk about the cattle not being used to go to the fields. So this would be prime area for resistance to basically just in the middle of the night do it, or was there a sense that there were some illegalities that were permitted against the Jatropha plantations? And were those, if so, were those based on some notions of moral economy?
So we've got Lydia and Tahira, and then we'll. Lydia, do you want to go first? Yeah.
I know you. Thanks, Mathilde. This is great. Thanks. I know you emphasize your emphasis on the local moral economy, local relations, but I wonder how you situate that in the broader model economy. So I'm wondering how issues like national interest, ideas about progress, ideas about people's sovereignty, those broader things that relate to the broader moral economy come into play locally.
Tahira, sorry.
Thank you very much, Mathilde. My question is about, it's actually related to, you mentioned something regarding class, gender, and age, and like how, for example, in some cases you mentioned women do not have say. So, whose moral economy count? Like, I find there is differentiation among the group themselves, like who is moralizing the land deal.
So thank you. You've made an outline for my paper, I think, with all these questions. They're amazing questions, all of them. Thank you. Whose moral economy counts? That's definitely a critical question, and how you force state attention to local moral economies. Because it's good to have them there and share these principles, but are they heard? And how is also great. And then, the everyday resistance as well. And how they, in a more sort of more sneakily way, will get themselves, assert these principles. So in this case, it was more actually instances of everyday resistance. There wasn't, I mean, as I left it, so I really need to go back and see how things have developed. And we were at the beginning, and so, you know, people were still giving the company a bit of time to deliver on its promises. And also, what was really interesting is that they, you know, a lot of their Drotofa plantation hadn't grown as expected. So a lot of villagers would still take the cattle to graze. You know, it was still, they could still go through, and for the Drotofa, they could go and graze there because the cattle wouldn't eat it. So they could graze around. So it wasn't always clear whether it was an act of, you know, deliberate resistance or more sort of like, you know, this is our grazing land and we need it. I think it's a bit of both. But mixed with fear of, you know, if we get caught. So I think they definitely needed these legitimizing notions and principles to sort of back their this risk that they would take in doing that, you know, in knowing that they were right in doing that and that they needed these lands to survive and it was their right to go. What forced the state to pay attention was more the involvement of the civil society and very local micropolitics. So again, I rushed on it very quickly, but basically the wealthy villagers were generally more connected, more educated. So, you know, in my 3-village case study, one managed to, they said not only they refused the land request and resisted intimidation, but they also recuperated some land that had been taken by the company, that had been given by their neighbors. And how they did that was like lobbying the head of the region, who was actually lending them, you know, who had entrusted them with his own cattle, so they had connections. But there hadn't been sort of more direct acts of vandalism or... but there were threats, a lot of talks, but, you know, we're still in a place of where the institutional bias is so strong. You know, they knew that their chances... You know, even those who had been a bit more daring, like this case, was saying basically, if they decide to go in, we have, you know, what can we do? If they decide to go in against our opinion, and, you know, they've respected our choice so far, but, you know, if they decide to plant there, what can we do? We're small and they have tractors. We can't read and they have tractors, was the discourse. Whose moral economy counts? Well, title of a paper, good title of a paper. Well, what I found interesting is that then, in this context, the arrival of an external actor, like a powerful actor, can actually induce, offer opportunities for challenging this, you know, power dynamics, patterns of domination, and also reasserting moral economic principle by poorer villagers. So that's what I realized, is that those, you know, talking to the company by, you know, against the back of their village elites was a way for some villagers to sort of do justice to themselves. And this is interesting, and I need to look at it a bit closer, maybe go back with that focus in mind, because I don't want to have, you know, in a way it was also my interpretation that, you know, I found that the support mechanisms were usually much, much weaker in those cases where there'd been conflicting struggles. So, but this is really the way it came across, sort of, you know, not necessarily, certainly not just to challenge power structures, because there was a big risk to that. They also wanted to take part, really be incorporated within the company, but definitely sort of, again, feeling justified to do it because their village leaders weren't helping them and they couldn't count on them.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Mathilde. I mean,
Thank
it's
you.
wonderful to have PhD students come back once the trauma of finishing has subsided somewhat, and to have that detailed, textured research speak to these bigger issues. It's wonderful, and it's even better to have a whole PhD in one word cloud. That's what happens. You can do with a distance of a year or two. Good whack of the audience here.
Thank you.
PhD
Great.
students starting up as part of the PASTRES program, as I mentioned before, the 6 new students who are all thinking about, well, some thinking very concretely about moral economy, hence the excitement with engaging with you. So after this session, we'll give you a little bit of a break, I'm sure, but it will be wonderful to
My pleasure.
to have the opportunity for them to have a discussion with you about what doing a PhD is really like.
Dan can support.
What about a little discussion about where is there a moral economy demonstrated in British capitalism today?
Yeah.
And I tend to
The
think
little
that
discussion,
children
really.
protesting
No, totally.
our longer term climate change economic interests are not being taken account of. Would that count as?
Absolutely.
That-
Emergent moral economies all over. My daughter was on the level last week.
Good. So it's my grandson.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I mean it's about recapturing those moral dimensions, which forms of capitalism that we've become used to have left aside. So yeah.
Tried to pretend it's not there. Yeah.
Well, and of course, morality and normative codes exist within any economy.
Right.
Yeah.
It's about surfacing them and asking exactly as to here opposed whose moral economy counts and claiming that. Anyway, I think that's a discussion for another day, Richard. But yeah, that's a big one. But thank you everybody for coming, and thank you again, Mathilde.
Thanks very much. Thank you for coming.